Thanks for joining us for today's podcast. I'm Sean Schmidt with The Silver Sheet. Today I have with me Jay Crowley, VP of UDI Solutions and Services with consulting firm USDM Life Sciences. I last spoke with Jay last September when he gave manufacturers last-minute tips on implementing unique device identification at their firms. Since the first wave of UDI rollout in September 2014 for high-risk, Class 3 products, there have been things, good, bad, and unforeseen, that manufacturers have grappled with. Today, Jay is going to give you a preview of a presentation he will give at the upcoming MedCon 2015 Industry Conference hosted by FDA and Xavier University. This mini webinar will address UDI roadblocks companies have faced and how they can learn from mistakes and successes that have been made by other manufacturers. Take it away, Jay.
Thanks, Sean, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Sean mentioned, I am with a consulting firm helping device manufacturers to implement UDI, and it's been a very interesting journey, I have to say, and some of the things that I think we had originally thought were going to be difficult aren't, and there are a number of unforeseen issues that we have run into. As Sean also mentioned, of course, we'll go into a lot more detail at the upcoming conference, but I did want to give you kind of an overview of the issues that we've been seeing so that you can be prepared for the presentation and hopefully be prepared with some specific questions or issues that have come your way. I'm going to cover, there's a number of slides here that we're going to go through. I'm going to cover them fairly quickly, but to try to give you a flavor of the things that we've seen that have caused some complexity as manufacturers have moved through their UDI compliance or moved into trying to become UDI compliant, might be a better way of putting that. The first issue, and I think this is an interesting issue because it speaks to, I think, the foundational nature of the issues that we're going to talk about largely. So the issues that we've seen aren't necessarily with UDI implementation in and of itself, but rather with kind of how an organization is set up and organized so that UDI compliance can be achieved. And the first bullet there really speaks to how most companies have grown, which is by acquisition. You buy other companies or you buy product lines of other companies, and sometimes you spin them off. So there tend to be siloed organizations that have grown up with the company as it's grown and organized. And so, trying to create a centralized approach to UDI is a challenge when you have sort of a decentralized organization. So getting everyone onto the same page is an important first step and one that's often overlooked in moving towards UDI compliance. And sort of to that end, what we find is that as people look at UDI and the things that need to be done to become UDI compliant, they decide, because they're making a label change often, they'll make other label changes. So it's not just, if you will, placing the UDI on the label, but rather a lot of rationalization of names and addresses that go on. So maybe it's the name, maybe it's the logo, maybe it's the colors, maybe it's the multiple addresses that are on labels. So there's a whole activity around the rationalization of names and addresses and labels that we see manufacturers undertaking at the same time. And then on sort of the other end of that is what we call SKU rationalization, or really understanding what you make. So looking at all of the SKUs that you have with an eye towards UDI compliance and really trying to figure out, okay, what of all of these SKUs that I have do I actually currently manufacture? Do I currently distribute in the US? Which of them are medical devices, et cetera, et cetera. So a whole lot of activity there, which is quite interesting as well. There is some uncertainty, and you'll see in the last couple of bullets here that there is some uncertainty about global UDI and where that's going, some uncertainty and ambiguity in the way that the rule is constructed, and even some uncertainty and ambiguity around what people are going to do with UDI outside of the device manufacturer. So there's some issues there that we see manufacturers struggling with as well. UDI has also uncovered a number of very interesting issues. I think a lot of them we didn't really anticipate or have good visibility into prior to the publication of the final rule and really the work that started in earnest to become UDI compliant. There are a number of business practices which have come under scrutiny, particularly the distribution of devices in non-sterile trays, implants that are distributed in non-sterile trays. A lot of private labeling activities, and we'll touch more about this in a moment when we talk about labeler. So there's some issues there that people are struggling with to understand as they try to become UDI compliant. There's also a number, as I touched on before, a number of business problems that UDI can solve, but people need to kind of figure out how that's going to work in this new paradigm as people start sharing information in a way that they haven't done before. One of the issues that we've seen, which we're trying very hard to mitigate, is having manufacturers apply UDI differently. So there is some flexibility built into the rule quite intentionally to deal with the broad array of device types, with the hope that most manufacturers, of course, would apply UDI in a similar way to similar devices. So we really want to see consistency across markets, and that does often require manufacturers to work together to understand how UDI should be applied to different device types. We've also seen some of the exceptions that were built into the rule, some of the general and specific exceptions that may not support downstream business practices. So there is one around kits, there is one for single-use devices, and we're seeing that people are maybe using devices differently than the way that those exceptions were originally envisioned and intended to be used. So some work there that needs to continue as well. One of the interesting issues that I touched on before and is become quite a challenge is really understanding all of the finished medical devices and accessories that you create and distribute in the U.S. And this often becomes, interestingly, a very difficult task, and one that can take quite a bit of time to understand, to really get your arms wrapped around all of the active SKUs that are considered finished medical devices and are distributed in the U.S. That, again, is the breadth of products that are subject to UDI. So understanding that, understanding how the device, the regulatory path to market, what is its PMA or 510K number, or is it exempt? Getting that lined up, and then underneath of that, lining up the product codes of those specific products often turns out to be a very time-consuming task, and product code drives a number of activities, including the upcoming 2015 compliance date for those devices, those implants and life-sustaining devices that were required under FDASIA. It also drives whether or not, for example, you can take advantage of the single-use device packaging exception. So all of that needs to be lined up before you can really even start to drive towards UDI compliance. And you can see a number of other issues there. One that is becoming, I think, quite an interesting issue is around combination products, and really understanding whether that combination product is regulated as a device. Its primary mode of action is that of a device. It has a regulatory pathway, which is medical device, and therefore subject to UDI, or is it particularly a drug? And now we're starting to see all of the activities around DSCSA, and whether or not the product that you have is actually really subject to those requirements. And so all of that really needs to be understood before you can really start to begin UDI implementation. This is an issue that has created quite a bit of controversy and quite a bit of confusion for a number of manufacturers, and it's around the regulatory concept of labeler. So hopefully, if you've seen and read the UDI regulation, you'll know that the entity that is responsible for UDI is an entity that FDA calls the labeler, and this is in contrast to terms that we often use, like manufacturer. The problem in the U.S. is that manufacturer is a very broad term and involves people who have likely no UDI responsibility, like a contract sterilizer or an importer, for example. So the entity responsible is labeler, and it's the same concept in the pharmaceutical space as it is in the medical device space. But given what are often fairly complex and involved business relationships between entities, understanding, particularly in the OEM and third-party labeling space, private labeling space, it becomes quite a challenge to understand who is really responsible for the device, if you will, and then therefore who is responsible for UDI and who is responsible for submitting data to the good ID. So there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of debate and discussion right now. It really causes manufacturers to go back and to review all of those supplier agreements or contracts that they have to understand how that relationship is created and maintained and who is going to do what around UDI. So there's a lot of sort of historical activities, things that have existed for a long time, people may not have looked at or reviewed in a very long time, and UDI is causing people to really take a look at and decide who is really responsible for this product and how is UDI going to play out in that space. There is a couple of other slides here. I don't probably want to spend a lot of time on them. I'm going to go through them at a high level and hopefully get to see anyone who is watching or listening at the conference that's coming up. But again, in the same way that we've talked about products and understanding what you make, we need to understand how they're labeled, how they're packaged, understand whether direct marking applies, and if it does, how you're going to apply that. So really, again, taking a very close look, which many manufacturers may not have done in a very long time, at how products are labeled and packaged and distributed, and therefore the UDI implementation implications of all of that. And with that, Sean, I'd like to thank everyone for their time and attention, and I'd like to turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks for the great presentation, Jay. I know that I will be looking forward to seeing your full presentation at MedCon 2015. And thank you, yes, you at home, work, or wherever you're listening, and check back soon for another Silver Sheet podcast.